Most of us have a sense of what depression is. For me, it feels like somebody jammed a syringe into my head, releasing a dark cloud over my mind that makes me view everything through a pessimistic lens. The relentless brooding, the anxious worrying, and second-guessing everything. But what does depression really look like? I'm pretty sure these irrational symptoms aren't just all in my head, even if they technically originate there. I'm curious, what would depression look like if we put it under a microscope? Is it more than just a chemical imbalance? And what exactly does that even mean? When someone breaks their leg, we have the tools to see the fracture. We can tell that a clogged artery increases the chances of heart disease, but with depression being seemingly invisible, it's tougher to pinpoint what's really going on, biologically speaking. To find out what scientists currently know about depression, I head to the Neuroscience department at Toronto's Centre for Addiction and Mental Health.
Yeah, before the advent of imaging, and I would say also the revolution in molecular biology, all we knew about depression was indirect. People were mostly talking about chemical imbalance. And the reason for that was that some antidepressant drugs that were discovered by chance that 50, 60 years ago augment, if you want, the function of certain neurotransmitter. There's a logical flaw in there. And in that it doesn't have to be. The more we know, the more complex it is.
Here's the thing, our brains are complex machines, interconnected in billions of ways. While brain chemicals like serotonin and dopamine play an essential role in regulating our mood and thinking, many studies indicate only 25% of depressed patients actually have low levels of them. And new brain scanning technology seems to indicate they're only one piece of the puzzle.
There's really been a revolution in how we can investigate the system to a much better understanding of how the brain works and how it doesn't work as well in the context of disorders.
Okay, so now that we have the technology to go where no neuroscientist has gone before, what exactly are we learning?
So this is the PET scanner room, and what we have over here is actually the PET scanner itself.
How does this thing work?
Well, people get an injection of a tracer, like a dye, and then you can make a dye that can target any individual site in the brain.
Right, so you could decide to look at a certain region of the brain or a certain type of molecule within the brain.
Certainly. We can look at changes in the brain that might happen in clinical depression. Like, for example, we've looked at a brain inflammation. What I mean by inflammation is the body's response to infection or trauma. It has been known that if one augments the body's response to inflammation or provokes inflammation, people often would have sad mood. So we have a marker that goes up when the brain makes an inflammatory response. We compared 20 healthy people and 20 people in the midst of a clinical depression and found actually a 30% rise in this marker of inflammation.
This inflammation is found all over the gray matter of the brain, and the more severe the depression, that meant higher degrees of inflammation. What could this inflammation be saying?
What our study shows is that it happens when the depression is present. It doesn't tell us which caused what. However, since we know that when you provoke inflammation, you can cause sad mood, most likely there is at least some level of probably causality between having inflammation and getting at least some depressive symptoms.
In other words, instead of thinking of depression as a disease in of itself, could it be the byproduct of something else? But what kind of diseases cause inflammation? Does all depression look the same in the brain?
There can be quite a bit of variability from one person to the next, and that might explain why the rates of response are not as optimal as they could be. Typically, 50% of people respond well to treatment, leaving another 50% that we need to find better ways.
Maybe we need to look elsewhere in the brain. Scientist Yuliya Nikolova is doing just that as she studies how trauma and stress can impact the brain.
Well, stress is a very common trigger of depression. More often than not, in fact, depressive episodes come in the wake of some sort of a stressful life event.
This has led Yuliya to study the part of our brain that regulates our response to stress and fear, the amygdala.
So the amygdala is actually one of the most densely connected structures in the human brain. So it's key to recognizing threat in the environment and responding to it very quickly.
The amygdala network evolved to help all animals survive life or death threats. The fight or flight response it triggers is supposed to only occur when there's real danger, but scientists believe the amygdala might be overactive in the brains of people predisposed to depression.
And we actually have evidence that hyperreactivity might predate the development of depression and anxiety.
So it's like the brains are more sensitive to threats in general.
Exactly. So of course we need our stress response to work properly in order to survive. What's the problem is that if it's always hyperactive, even if there really is no actual threat present.
To find out how chronic stress could lead to depression, Yuliya's team compared the brains of individuals having experienced prolonged stress against healthy controls.
Well, there was a dramatic increase in degree from the control to the stress group. Not only is the amygdala getting larger, but it's also getting more connected with other brain regions.
The amygdala formed stronger connections with brain regions that control instinctive behavior while decreasing those that regulate our behavior, like the prefrontal cortex. What could that possibly mean?
So the brain becomes over-specialized with dealing with stressors and threats, which comes at the expense of other potentially behaviorally and clinically relevant functions. So the amygdala is becoming more of a driver of behavior.
Maybe this rewiring of our brain explains why worrisome, anxious thoughts can feel so out of control. And if the depression gets worse, it can even affect our memory.
Perhaps one of the most consistent findings is the reduction in hippocampal volume.
The hippocampus is the part of the brain that regulates memory. Repeated studies indicate that the hippocampus is shrinking in depression, and it gets worse with more depressive episodes.
Because of the involvement of the hippocampus in memory function, if your hippocampus gets smaller, chances are your memory performance will suffer.
People with depression often report cloudy and unreliable memory. On top of that, the hippocampus is supposed to put the brakes on that overactive amygdala.
It can become even less effective at shutting down the stress response, so you end up in this sort of vicious
Perpetual cycle. Now the real question, is there anything we can do about it?
Depression is a very complex disease. What you see in one person's brain may not be the same as what you see in another.
It may be that there could be 5 to 10 common different biologies that occur in clinical depression, and if we can identify the key ones, that there might be better targeted treatments for this purpose.
Then we can also perform different types of manipulations. We can test novel drugs. We can start to develop more biologically informed treatments.
Right now, doctors don't have a standardized blood test to tell us what kind of depression we have, so it's more on us to monitor our own brains, so to speak. We all have a unique story of depression, which likely means one of these unique brain biologies. The more we know about our own case, which symptoms we have, how long we've had the depression, the more we can reverse engineer what might be causing it and which therapies could work best, with a little trial and error. Sounds simple, right? Well, not so much. The good news is, if you're wondering, it's a step in the right direction. And we can do this together. If you subscribe, you'll continue to get more fascinating insights into the science of mental health. Until next time, Wonder Warriors.